Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Today I'm going to go over a brief history of liberalism, primarily because sometime very soon, once I'm done reading it, I plan to do one or more items on John Mearsheimer's important work, Bound to Fail, which discusses the impending fall of the international liberal order. And it's important that we understand what we're all talking about, because otherwise people associate with political labels, and no matter what you try to say, it's like impossible to communicate ideas. So this is going to be like a few minutes that compresses pretty much the history of Western social philosophy, as well as the parallels that earlier forms of it have elsewhere in the world. So, the history of Western philosophy is largely dependent on a single question. This is the question that Plato's dialogues ask over and over again. It's also found in pre-Socratic Greek philosophy in prominent roles. I'd say if you want to understand that, look at F.M. Cornford's seminal work, From Religion to Philosophy. Basically, it's found in Aristotle, and basically almost all philosophy ends up grappling with this question, which is, what is justice? What is a good society? So, Western philosophy is centered around that question. You have metaphysics, you have all these other branches, ontology, but they all come back to this in one way or another. So philosophical inquiry in the Western tradition is fundamentally a question of ethics. And so for example, one of F.M. Cornford's points is that if you look at Anaximander, and Anaximander's ideas of what matter is made out of, Anaximander makes this into an ethical question. You start off with the indefinite, and through a theft from the indefinite you get the elements, and the elements repay that debt in their eventual destruction. And Cornford ties this into the cycles of the fates and a number of other things. It's really, really very interesting. His points on the origin of religion are not as haven't weathered as well, but his points on pre-Socratic Greek philosophy and the connection from Hesiod to the early Greek philosophers is something which is still considered important today. So now, having said all that, let's get into sort of the first major survey of how people actually looked at social justice in their day, and that was Aristotle's Politics. Now, Aristotle's Politics basically can be seen as a scholarly survey rather than a philosophical exposition. In other words, to a large extent, Aristotle was less interested in trying to say, what is justice, as he was trying to understand how do social systems currently work. So Aristotle's main point here was that individuals form households, households form communities. An important point to understand in Aristotle's day is that these households weren't merely, a nuclear family; they were an extended family business. So households were the seat of production as well as consumption. They tended to be multi-generational, and consequently, they were self-sufficient in a way in which perhaps the modern nuclear family isn't so much. Additionally, Aristotle talked a lot about gender relations. There is a very good argument to be made that he was naive in terms of how these things actually worked in his society. That these were sort of the ways everybody talks about them, not the way things actually worked. I'd recommend Ancient Greek Love Magic by Chris Brown as a review of gender relations in ancient Greece, looking at things like love charms and things like that. Fascinating book. But the very basic idea in an Aristotelian social order is that individuals form households. Households are the smallest self-sufficient unit of society. Households band together in order to solve their common problems. They form communities. They need community management because they have common problems. And this allows for a shared flourishing simply by coming together and solving these problems. Communities, we can then extrapolate, might bind together with other communities and form larger social units until finally you get, something like, Alexander's empire or something like that. So Aristotelian social philosophy is very bottom up. It is centered around family, and it's centered around small business. And it's descriptive, it's not prescriptive. And for this reason, I think one of the important things is that Aristotle, I think, provided a very large amount of material that is what we would call transversal. In other words, it's applicable to a wide variety of societies with shared characteristics. So when you go and you look at many other societies, in fact, you find that they work along ways reminiscent of what Aristotle talked about. They may not be the same, and they may not think about it the same way, but many of the dynamics are the same, or at least similar. Now, once you get to the Middle Ages, this gets further refined by sort of, if you will, a Catholic reimagining of Aristotelian philosophy in the form of Thomism. This comes from Thomas Aquinas. I'm not really going to go into Thomism too much, but Thomism starts talking about things like property and the relationship of this to this process and things like that. Finally, all of this gets started to turn on its head once we start reaching after the Renaissance is done. You have this set of major social upheavals. Some of these are religious upheavals with the Reformation. Some of them are sort of turning against the great Islamification of Europe in the sense of the Renaissance, because a lot of Islamic thinkers became very popular during the Renaissance. And part of this ends up them turning against the classics in the same way. So the first thinker in this regard, which begins to set the basis for liberalism, is Hobbes. And Hobbes tries to imagine a society, a basis for understanding society, that isn't built around people collaborating for the common good. And what he comes up with is a society which is around protecting people from bad things. And Hobbesian differs from Aristotelianism in just about every way imaginable. And in fact, it's almost the exact opposite, where Aristotle saw an individual isolated from society as being no more complete than a dismembered hand, I think was the way he put it. Hobbes sees individuals as being fundamentally self-complete agents by themselves. Well, Aristotle sees society coming together from smaller units and being built upward. Hobbes saw the ideal form of society being that of an absolute monarch, manifesting the will of the people. And there's a good argument to be made that the United States government is a very Hobbesian government. We just elect our absolute monarchs every 4 years. and instead of government being there to solve common problems, government is there to protect us. So that's Hobbes's philosophical foundations. Then this gets further built on by Locke, who then kind of merges some aspects of atomism and some other things. We end up with a lot of emphasis on property rights out of Locke. But Locke is sort of the first thinker that starts saying, okay, well, if the state is so big and powerful, then individuals have to have rights against the state. So Locke is sort of the first thinker in terms of the natural rights theory. And so natural rights theory then becomes a part of this sort of centralized state theory of Hobbes. And then finally, the next major thinker we get is Rousseau. Rousseau starts out as something of a critic of liberalism, but he ends up basically making large amounts of contributions to the development of liberalism. And in particular, Rousseau brings some of these things back to Hobbes, while at the same time bringing some things, extending some aspects of Locke. So Rousseau's concept of the general will is a very Hobbesian concept, while this idea that we're born free but everywhere in chains is an extension of Locke's right to liberty. So what we get out of this is that by the time the United States is formed, the United Kingdom is a country which has been not only at the foundation of liberalism as this school of thought, but also something which at that point had largely, liberalism had largely taken it over. We were in the middle of something called the Tory exclusion, which was basically a point where the UK had been under, if you will, the political hegemony of the Whigs. And the Whigs were basically the liberal industrialist party. And, I guess one thing getting back to Locke is that one aspect of Locke's work was the state as enforcer of property, primarily as protector of the rich against poor. This is something where it's hard to read Adam Smith as supportive of this, because you can see a lot of ambivalence in Adam Smith's works towards the protection of rich against poor in liberal society. There are people who argue that he was fundamentally for it. There are plenty of people who argue he was fundamentally against, Karl Marx included. But Adam Smith's, I don't know. I'm not going to spend too much time on Adam Smith. I would strongly recommend reading the entirety of Wealth of Nations in a Theory of Moral Sentiments, however, because you'll get a very different view of Smith than you get from the libertarian websites. But at any rate, so you had the Whig hegemony at that time, and you had some slightly conservative Whigs like Edmund Burke, who is, I guess, a moderate Whig. But at any rate, the Whigs were the Liberal Party, and this held intellectual hegemony throughout the entire British Kingdom and its colonies. So the United States, when the United States rebelled successfully and set up their own government, treated the Constitution in explicitly liberal terms. The idea, basically you have 2 or 3 explicit references to Locke, whether in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, the right to security in one's person and property, that can only be taken away through due process of law, is written in explicitly Lockean terms. So the United States has always been an explicitly liberal country. Okay, I'm not saying that in positive terms. I actually prefer Aristotelian social orders. And this has been sort of innately linked to sort of the rise eventually of American industrialism, capitalism, and eventually hegemony. However, because of the fact that liberal has become a word relating to a specific take on liberalism in the United States, it's very difficult for people to think about this concept. In fact, all of the major founding thinkers of American conservatism were all liberals, right? You have Edmund Burke, a liberal, moderate liberal. And that's basically, where people look back to. It's like, okay, well, how do we make liberalism work? And the Democrats think that liberalism is for family issues and sexuality, but that business should be bounded by democratic institutions. In other words, the idea is that we should liberate people, individuals, from social expectations in what they see as part of their personal private lives, while trying to have a Hobbesian state, a very big centralized state, take on big business. That's their take on liberalism. The Republicans' take on liberalism is that liberalism is for businesses, while for the family we should be thinking about, tradition and perhaps religion. And so Republicans have a tendency of trying to liberate businesses from social expectations in the same way the Democrats try to liberate individuals from social expectations. And in fact, they're part of the same dimension, because if you erode the family as a matter of mutual support, who's going to take over? It's going to be business and the government. If you empower business over the individual, it's going to erode the family. So these are in fact mutually dependent aspects, if you will, almost of the same. I hate to say the same agenda because that assumes like somebody's planning it, but I would say the same stream of history. And then, of course, you have the libertarians that say, yeah, whatever, liberate everybody from everything and just let the government enforce contracts, which is very, very Lockean in certain ways, because now you have the use of force by the state in more or less explicit terms to enforce powerful against less powerful in contract negotiations. So, where does this leave us today? We have in liberalism, as we understand it internationally, not in the way people use it in American politics, is that liberalism is a social theory that emphasizes individualism, individual rights over collective rights and the community, and it emphasizes freedom of ownership over social obligations with that ownership. And the thing you have to understand about all of this is that most of the world doesn't work that way. Most of the world doesn't actually want that. They want the human contact that comes with retiring and living with their own children. They want, and if not their own children, then perhaps their siblings' children. They want the financial security that comes from small businesses being able to have protected places in the economy, and other things like this. And so this leads to a lot of social conflicts. And it's one of the reasons why I think that that liberalism as an international ideology is very, very much self-limiting. I'd also point out that much of the world was heavily victimized by colonialism, and because much of the world was victimized by colonialism, they were the ones subsidizing the liberal revolutions in the West. They didn't see the benefits of it. Any benefit of it was taken from them, right? And even in the West, I think, like, lower working classes are facing more and more financial insecurity. There's a growing gap between rich and poor, and these things fundamentally come from the tenets of Hobbes, Locke, and the rest. And finally, there's an open question on what the state should be, right? To the liberal thinker, and I direct probably to Rawls as sort of the most recent exponent of this. The state is sort of a neutral spot for battlegrounds of agendas. That we should be, for example, while we should be phrasing our concerns in secular terms, it's still a battleground of people with their own belief systems and their own emphases, fighting over what they think is best. Other concepts of the state are quite possible. You could see, for example, the state as a arbiter of cross-community or intra-community concerns. That, maybe family law should be run by religious communities, and the state should be the one to say both people need to be part of the same community before they can get married, because then otherwise the breakdown of this self-government by communities would happen. And there are countries that work like that, right? So what I'm getting at here is that the world's a very diverse place, and liberalism as a whole tends to try to McDonaldify culture, because a key premise is that we're going to liberate people from culture into individual rights. And most of the world doesn't want that. So we're stuck with some places being explicitly very liberal, and other countries wanting to chart their own alternative. And my view is there's nothing wrong with that. At any rate, that's all I have for you today. Talk to you later.